Dark psychology isn't always about villains in movies or manipulative masterminds. Sometimes it's the everyday behaviors, subtle, familiar, almost invisible, that end up controlling us the most. What makes these tactics so dangerous is that many people use them unconsciously. They learned them from childhood, past relationships, or toxic workplaces. And once these patterns start operating under the surface, they can bend human behavior like soft metal. Today, we'll break down 4 of the most common unconscious manipulation tactics: gaslighting, love bombing, the foot in the door technique, and the silent treatment. More importantly, we'll explore why people use these tactics and how they quietly shape the emotional climate of our lives. Gaslighting, rewriting your reality. Gaslighting is one of the most corrosive psychological tactics because it attacks the foundation of who you are, your perception of reality. It usually starts small. A coworker insists they never promised to send the report, even though you both remember the conversation. A partner claims you're too sensitive when you react to something hurtful. A manager tells you your memory is off, even though you know exactly what you heard. Over time, these micro-denials accumulate. You start second-guessing your instincts. Your confidence cracks. You apologize for things that aren't your fault. You hesitate to speak up because you're afraid you might be wrong again. This is the power of gaslighting. It creates dependency. If you can't trust your own judgment, you begin relying on someone else's version of the truth, even when they're the one distorting it. But here's the twist. Many gaslighters don't think of themselves as manipulators. Some do it because they fear accountability. Some do it to avoid shame. And some do it because they grew up in environments where denial was the only way to survive conflict. Gaslighting thrives wherever truth becomes negotiable: relationships, families, and especially workplaces where status or reputation is on the line. Love bombing, the explosion of affection. On the surface, love bombing feels like magic. The sudden attention, the overwhelming compliments, the intensity that feels like destiny. But love bombing isn't about affection. It's about acceleration. It pushes the relationship forward so quickly that you don't have time to evaluate what's happening. You're swept into a tidal wave of connection before you realize you're being carried somewhere you didn't choose. What makes love bombing so deceptive is that it often feels good. It's flattering. It's exciting. It feels like being chosen. But underneath the warmth is a psychological hook. If I make you feel extraordinary now, you'll tolerate my withdrawal later. This is why love bombing is common in toxic workplaces too. A boss who showers you with praise on your first week but becomes distant and demanding later. A company that sells you the dream culture but swaps it out for burnout once you're locked in. Love bombing is rarely intentional. Many people do it to soothe their own insecurity, to fast-track closeness, or to avoid the slow, vulnerable process of building trust. But once the high ends, the emotional crash creates confusion. And confusion is one of the easiest emotions to manipulate. The foot in the door technique. The slow capture. 310-410. Not all manipulation is dramatic or emotional. Sometimes it's quiet, methodical, almost polite. The foot in the door technique works like this. If someone agrees to a small request, they're far more likely to agree to a bigger one later. A colleague says, "Hey, could you check this file quickly?" "Sure." A week later, "Could you also help with this other task?" Then, "Actually, could you take over the whole project? You're so good at it." It feels like a gradient, not a trap. That's why it works. Humans want to stay consistent with their past actions. If you've already said yes, saying no creates internal tension. So you keep saying yes, even when it starts draining you. In relationships, this looks like, "Can you text me when you get home?" Then, "Can you text me all day so I know you're okay?" Then, "Why didn't you answer immediately? Who were you with?" A slow drift from reasonable to controlling. Again, many people don't realize they're doing this. They start with small requests because they're afraid of rejection. They expand the requests because it worked the first time. What begins as insecurity can quietly evolve into control. The silent treatment. Punishment. Through absence. Few tactics are as psychologically painful as the silent treatment, because it weaponizes something we deeply need: connection. Silence can feel like a void, a punishment, a withdrawal of humanity itself. In workplaces, it shows up as a manager who suddenly stops responding, leaving you anxious about your performance. In relationships, it appears as the cold shoulder, the unread messages, the "I'm fine" accompanied by emotional disappearance. The silent treatment creates fear of abandonment, rejection, being in trouble. And that fear often makes people overcompensate. They apologize, they chase, they fold. But here's the sobering truth. Most people who use the silent treatment aren't trying to manipulate. They're emotionally flooded. They don't know how to communicate. They fear conflict or vulnerability. Silence becomes a shield, one that unfortunately feels like a weapon to everyone around them. When silence is used to avoid responsibility or to punish, it becomes toxic. When it's used to regulate emotion, it can be healthy, but only if it's communicated. The difference between manipulation and coping is transparency. Dark psychology isn't always malicious. Sometimes it's a learned survival pattern, an unconscious habit, or an emotional blind spot passed down through generations or reinforced in workplaces built on fear instead of respect. Recognizing these tactics doesn't just protect you, it also helps you understand the hidden wounds in the people who use them. The real question now is this: which of these dark psychology tricks have you seen the most, and do you think the person using them knew what they were doing?